Good morning, guys. My name's Gary Simpson. I'm a retired firefighter from up in New Hampshire. I did 27 years in the fire service, and I've come to work for Bullard, and I've been working with them now for about 12 years, teaching firefighters thermal imaging from a firefighter's perspective. So the information that we're going to cover over the next hour or so is coming to you from a firefighter's point of view. I'm not trying to sell you anything on the thermal imaging. I'm only trying to get you to understand how this thermal imager is going to work for you guys in the field. What I want to do is just talk to you about the Eclipse LD. The Eclipse LD standard is a 160 by 120 thermal imager. Again, when I talk 160 by 120, we're talking lines of resolution with the imager. The imager itself weighs 2 pounds. The battery is 3 hours of actual use, and the display on the thermal imager is 3.5 inches, and what we're doing is measuring that from corner to corner. When I look at the imager itself, I just want to go over some of the dynamics of the imager. Up here on the top, we got the on-off switch, thermal throttle, DVR recorder, battery release, and display. Quite obvious, when I look at the imager here, we're looking at the display. If I follow it to the front, first black area that I come to is actually the on-off switch for the thermal imager. You'll see another black area up here on the front. This portion of the imager is actually going to be able to control the thermal throttle and DVR for us, just working in that button area. If I turn the imager around and look at the bottom, you'll just see that there's a little slide lock. I pull back on the lock, the battery slides out. You'll see that there's a groove in the battery, there's a groove in the imager. The only way the battery can go in is if you line those two grooves up. Slide the battery in until you hear it click. It's locked in place, and your imager is up for running now. As far as additional features that I can put on the thermal imager, we can bring that imager up from a 160 by 120 to a 320 by 240. We're actually doubling the lines of resolution. We can also put in a DVR recorder. Again, DVR recorder is going to be used in this area here, and you're going to get up to 5 hours of recorded time. On the right-hand side of the imager, we can put in temperature measurement, and we can also put in a heat bar temperature gauge. On the front of the imager, again, we can put in the thermal throttle that will assist in some different modes as far as using the imager. And again, high heat colorization, where we can color the image to temperature variations. So what I want to do is just talk with you guys a little bit about what thermal imaging is and how it's actually going to work for us as firefighters. So if I give you a thermal imager and I send you into the field and I say, hey, use this thermal imager to find somebody in a fire, to look for heat signatures inside the building. What is it that the imager is really doing? What it's doing is it's taking heat energy and it's putting it into an image. And when I look at the image, I have to interpret as to what's going on. So when we're talking about heat energy, it's not like light. If I were to take and introduce light into a smoky situation, the light is very minimal as to the effective range of it. But when I'm using a thermal imager, what I'm doing is I'm taking heat energy, i.e. a fire, and you guys know that no matter how smoky that this room is right now, if I got a fire, I'm actually feeling the heat through the smoke, even though I may not be able to see it. So I got a short video that I just want to try to put up here on the screen, let you guys look at, and hopefully you'll understand a little bit better as to what I'm talking about.
Visible light with its short wavelength is easily blocked. Remember that smoke is simply the unburned byproducts of combustion suspended by heated air. These unburned byproducts, being larger than a tiny wavelength of light, actually block and reflect back the light. You notice in smoke and in fog that light is easily reflected and unable to penetrate moderate concentrations. IR, with its longer wavelength, essentially weaves through the smoke. It is not blocked by the particles, and therefore the energy makes it to the detector inside the TI. If you consider that IR is essentially what we perceive as heat, then in every structure fire, you verify that heat penetrates smoke. This is why your TI can see when the human eye cannot.
All right, so just as a follow-up, after watching the video, I just want to make sure everybody understands how the heat energy is actually working. So if we think of all of these particles, these little circles right here, as smoke in front of me, I come into the building and I've got my $1 million Rescue Me flashlight. It doesn't matter how bright and powerful this flashlight is. When I put it into this smoke, that image is always being reflected back at me, and I can't see through the smoke, no matter how good the flashlight is. But you guys have all been in a fire situation. We introduce light, and the light might make it to the first or second particle, and then it's being reflected back towards you. But when I get into the fire, and I actually have fire and heat, the heat that's being generated by the fire doesn't just hit the carbon particle and come back at us. What it's doing is it's working its way through all of these different circles, and you ultimately over there are feeling the heat, right? So the imager is able to actually see through all these carbon particles, and it's showing me the heat signature that's being delivered by the fire, or whatever the heat signature is that's making the heat at that point in time. All right, now that we've talked about the difference between heat energy and light energy, and we understand that the imager is only using heat, you guys now understand that it doesn't matter how dark or what you can see in the building, the image that we're getting is a heat image and not a light image. So I've got another quick video here that I just want to run by. It's going to explain to you what that heat energy is doing once it reaches the lens or the front of the imager.
The infrared energy, or IR, enters the TI through the lens located at the front of the imager. The IR passes the chopper wheel on a BST-based imager, or the open shutter on a microbolometer. This energy then hits the IR detector, called a focal plane array, or FPA. The information from the FPA is then processed by an electronics package and converted into a video signal. This signal is displayed on the LCD screen of the TI, creating the thermal image.
All right, now just a follow-up to the video that you saw, when the heat energy is coming into the front of the thermal imager, it's going through the lens, and the imager has what we call a germanium lens, which actually allows heat energy to come into the imager. The next thing that it comes up against inside the imager is a shutter. And as you guys are using the thermal imager, you'll notice that every once in a while you're going to see like a freeze frame with the imager. And we're going to go into more detail with this later on. But that's actually the shutter. Some of you guys that are in the class still have the older, what we call BST imagers. And instead of having a shutter, there was actually what we call a chopper wheel on the inside of the imager. And what that was doing is constantly getting the heat out of the image. And the reason that we had to do that is because it leads into the third item of the imager, which is the focal plane array. And when we talk about focal plane array, you remember me earlier talking to you about 60 by 80 and 160 by 120 and 320 by 240, and you heard all those numbers there? Well, that's actually where we're at right now. We're at the focal plane array. And the higher the numbers, the more lines of resolution, the more image clarity that you're going to get with the thermal imager. This is also what's actually giving us the image. what we're doing is the imager is using what we call pixels to collect all the heat energy. And depending on how much heat energy is inside that pixel tells us exactly the warmest and coolest things that we're seeing in the image. What it's doing is it's taking all that information from those 320 by 240 pixels and it's sending it up to a processor, and the processor is actually putting it into an image and sending that image up to the display, where we as firefighters are trying to take heat energy and see it as an actual picture as to what we're thinking. Not really a picture, it's really heat energy being displayed in shades of black and white. All right, we're slowly getting through the imager and what's actually happening. So now we've taken the heat energy, we've brought it through the thermal imager, and we've got all this black and white up here on the display. And that's what we as firefighters have to work with, is the black and the white that we're seeing here with the thermal imager. So when we're talking about black and white, white is always going to be the hottest object in the field of view, and black is always going to be the coldest object. Now, one of the questions I always ask with a thermal imager is, what do you use the imager for? And 99 times out of 100, you guys are going to tell me that you're going to use it for search and rescue. Well, what I want to do is just ask you a question about the thermal imager and what's going to happen in search and rescue. So I've got the thermal imager, and I go into a room, I have a fire, I take the imager, I look around, and I see what I believe to be my victim over here in the corner. So if I see that victim, how do you think he's going to show up in the thermal imager?
Could be white.
Okay, so let's just think about this for a minute. I didn't explain the fire. I just said that we have a fire. It doesn't matter about the fire. What it matters about is temperature. So the fire in this situation is an overheated motor in a data projector up here. I have white smoke, and the temperature in the room is 70 degrees. But my skin temperature is 90. So in that situation right there, when I said, what color is the victim? And you said it's white, you guys are absolutely right. But all I have to do is change the heat signature. And this time I come into the very same room, but it's a room and contents fire, and the temperature in this room is 300 degrees. 300 is very realistic for me as a firefighter. So if the room is 300 degrees, and my victim is in this room, and the victim's skin temperature is still 90 degrees, in that fire, my victim is actually going to be black, and the room is going to be white. But somewhere in between that small incipient fire, overheated motor, and free burning fire, temperatures start to come together. So I've got a little bit bigger fire, but it's not a big fire, big room and contents fire. The temperature in this room becomes 90 degrees. The victim's skin temperature is 90 degrees. So if I got object A over here 90 degrees and object B over here 90 degrees, if I lay them on top of each other, there's no heat difference. So in that situation, with the background of 90, the person's skin temperature 90 degrees, the imager doesn't show me anything. And does that start to make sense to you guys a little bit now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What we'll do is we'll go into the next section, and we're just going to talk about how the imager works itself. Understand the hottest object in the field of view, what the imager is seeing, is always going to be white or the lightest shade. The coldest object in the field of view is going to be dark or black or the darker shades. Whatever you're seeing is always going to be relative to the area that you're looking at. Understand, this time I come into the room and my background is fairly dark and I have a warm object. All of this is going to be black and this is going to be white. But if I introduce a second object, and we'll say the background initially was 50 degrees, this object was 100, black and white. I introduce a third object, the background stays the same. It's still 50 degrees. This object is 100 degrees. It was just showing up as white, but now I introduce another object into that field of view, and the temperature of this object is 200 degrees. This object here is automatically going to shift down as a cooler object. So now you're actually going to get 3 different shades versus 2. You guys have an understanding of what I'm talking about here?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now that you kind of understand the black and the white, what I want to try to just clear up for us in the field is image quality and what we're seeing and why we're seeing things. I go to a situation, and when I get there, I have what appears to be, very good contrast. I can see people, I can see the table, I can see the chairs, and I can see everything that's going on inside this room with the thermal imager. But 2 days later, I go to this very same room, and I take out the imager, and when I hold up the imager and I look at it, everything just kind of blends together. And in that situation, it's what we call very low contrast. So it's the same room, nothing has changed, with the exception of temperature. When I come into the room, everything is absorbing and dissipating heat. So it's giving me heat energy. And it gives me a very high contrast image. I can see everything that's happening inside the room. But if I come into a room and the temperature in this room, let's just say it's Friday afternoon and we drop the air conditioner down to 70 degrees. I'm in Texas, it's summertime, the temperature is 100+ degrees. Friday afternoon, I set the thermostat for 70 because when I come in Monday morning, I want things to be cool when I come to work. At 5 o'clock Monday morning, you guys respond to this room here, and the building has been entirely vacant. There's been no thermal movement inside the building whatsoever, and everything is taken on the temperature of 70 degrees. Friday afternoon, very clear image. Monday morning at 5 o'clock, everything just kind of blends together. When that happens, we lose the contrast of the imager. It's not that the imager has failed or has done anything wrong. It's merely the fact that we've changed the conditions, the heat conditions inside this room. Okay. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yep.
All right, what I want to do is just build on black and white and image interpretation. The next thing I just want to cover real quickly is a thing called thermal saturation. If you go back 10 years ago with thermal imagers, we used to get whiteout with a thermal imager. When the imager was exposed to a lot of heat, it would white out and you wouldn't be able to see anything. That was actually a failure of the thermal imager back then. Thermal imagers now really don't white out. What you do get is what we call a thermal saturation. And this can happen on any thermal imager. Basically what it is there's so much heat, there's so many BTUs being generated, the imager can't process the information fast enough. So if you remember earlier, when we were talking about the thermal imagers, 320 by 240, all right? When we talk about 320 by 240, what we're actually talking about is pixels. Well, think of a pixel as something like this. You know, if this was an open container, I could pour water into the container and eventually it would fill up, overflow, and the water would go onto the floor. With a thermal imager, the pixel is actually absorbing heat. And sooner or later, it's going to fill up, overflow, and do what we call saturate into the other pixels. And if all the pixels are saturated, too much heat, the image tends to go blank on us. All right? The more thermal saturation you have, the harder it is to actually interpret what's going on. To make this image go away, it's very simple, guys. All we have to do is put the imager down, get it away from the heat energy that's being generated right now. All right, once we get it away from it, the imager processes the heat that's already in all these pixels right here. And once it processes that heat, we have nice clear pixels, empty pixels, and the image comes back to us right away. Do you guys have a better understanding of thermal saturation now?
Yeah, Gary.
Perfect. Okay, continuing with image interpretation, the next thing that plays a role in interpreting what's going on with black and white in the imager and the display is a thing that we call thermal inversion, and we need to cover this real quick. So when we look at thermal inversion, basically the definition is it occurs when an object changes shade, even though its temperature has not, due to the environmental changes. So if I just look at this image right here, and I understand it's kind of hard to look at, you actually see the image of a firefighter right here. This is actually a ladder that he's off of right now. And down here on the ground, there's actually two firefighters that are footing the ladder. And if you notice, all three firefighters are pretty much the same shade of black and white. But if I look at this firefighter up here, if you look at these windows right here, there's a lot of heat that's being generated in these windows. This individual right here, he was probably inside. And when he was inside, he came from the cooler environment, went into the building, and he was actually showing up as a cool object. But while he was inside, under those fire conditions, his gear is absorbing heat. So now he's taken out of the interior of the building, we put him up here on the roof, and he becomes part of roof operations. When he came out of the building, up the ladder, and got onto the roof, the temperature of his gear didn't change. When he was inside the building, his gear was actually the cooler object and he was showing up as black. But as soon as the environmental temperature changed and it was cooler outside, his gear being warmer than what the outside air temperature is, he immediately showed up as white, even though the temperature of his gear didn't change. Does that make sense to you guys? Perfect. What I want to do is just spend a little bit of time talking to you about some TI confusion. So if you look, I just have a piece of plexiglass right here, and clear plexiglass with my eyes. You can clearly look through the plexiglass and you can see, you know, everything that's happening, computers and stuff on the desk, and you can see the wall out in front of you. And if I take and rotate the plexiglass around, and I hold the imager where there is no plexiglass, again, I can look at the imager and I can see through and I can see the computer. If I scan up here, you know, I see a little bit of the white from the light that's up above our head. And I scan around here to the right, I see that white line. That's actually the temperature of the metal up above the screen that we can see with our eyes. We can see what appears to be maybe 2x4s in the wall, a difference of temperature between the sheetrock and the 2x4 in the wall. So we got a lot of definition as to what's going on right there. if I take and I simply turn the plexiglass around, and now I'm looking through the plexiglass. With my eyes, I'm still seeing the computer and I'm seeing all that stuff out there, but the imager just shows up as a blank screen. And if you watch carefully, you just saw a whole bunch of heat start to come into the image. Matter of fact, if you look at the imager, my hand is actually behind the imager, and I'm seeing what my hand is doing as a reflection in the plexiglass. So the imager can't see through that the plexiglass. Matter of fact, I can take my hand, can clearly see with the camera, my hand goes behind the plexiglass and I see it. But with the thermal imager, I can't see my hand. If I were to take and rotate it around and there is no plexiglass, as my hand comes into the image, I can clearly see the outline of my hand, and I take it away, it disappears. Again, one more time, plexiglass, image goes blank. You're seeing a little bit of the white going on there. That's actually a reflection off the plexiglass. And if I put my hand into it, even though you can see it with your eyes, with the imager, it doesn't exist. So, as Steve's walking in with the camera, you can see that we're looking at a marker board right here. Camera, you can clearly see my hand in front of it. And what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to bring up the thermal imager. And when I'm looking with the thermal imager, if you look right here, you can see my image. If you look over here to the right, you can see Steve's image. And right here in the middle, you see a little bit darker image. That's actually the thermal imager. You can see me putting my hand down on top of the imager right there. What I'm going to do is, I'm just going to reach over here and I'm going to grab a lighter, and I introduce the lighter to the image, fire being the hottest object. You see the white kind of going on the display. If I take and pull the lighter back, it's still showing up as white. But what I want you to understand right now is that if you came into a room and this room is full of smoke, and I take the imager and I look to the left, this is the image that I'm seeing. And the fire is actually behind me at this point in time. So you open up a hand line and you're trying to cool things down and make that white image go away and make everything nice and dark. And you spray water for a minute or so, but the white doesn't disappear. It's still there. What's happening is the image isn't seeing the temperature of the board itself. It's actually seeing a reflective temperature of something that's actually going on behind you. So this room could be totally full of smoke. The fire is actually off to the right, but when you look to the left, because you have this shiny object right here, you're actually thinking that the fire is off to your left. All right, guys, what I want to do is just go over thermal imaging and water condensation, any of the liquid stuff that falls down from the sky. The first thing is the imager is going to work in any of these conditions. It just depends on how much rain or fog we have going on. So I come out, I take the imager, I may be able to see half a mile away with a thermal imager on a good day. But I make it a rainy day, foggy day, my distance is going to diminish. If you got light rain, the imager is going to work fine. If you have heavy rain, the imager, you're not going to see anything with the imager. If I got light snow, the imager will work. If I got a blizzard coming through, I'm not going to see anything. I got light fog, you're going to be able to see at a distance through the fog. If you got heavy fog, you may not be able to see 20 feet out in front of the imager. But the one thing that really confuses firefighters is condensation. So when you guys go into a building, you got a little room and contents fire, temperature outside is 45, 50 degrees. As soon as you go into the building, your mass fogs up and you have to do this number here, wipe off the condensation on your face piece. The same condensation that's sitting there on the face piece is up here on the lens of the imager, and it's also over here on the display. So when you guys go into the building and you have to reach up and do this in order for yourself to see through the thermal image, or see through your face piece, you're going to have to reach up here, wipe off the condensation of the lens, wipe off the condensation on the display. 2 or 3 times of doing this, the condensation goes away. Same thing, 2 or 3 times of doing this on the lens or display of the imager, the condensation will disappear. What we do is, or what we got now, we have a little video clip. I just want to show you what happens when we have water and we expose somebody to water. What you're going to see is the water is going to mask any heat signature. Anything that's up out of the water, you're still going to see. Anything below the surface of the water, you're not going to see. All right, guys, next thing I just want to cover real quickly is what we call the modes of a thermal imager. So when we're using the thermal imager and we turn the imager on, the imager is going to come up into what we call high gain mode. Think of the gains as gears in a car. So when I get into the car, I start out slow, I'm in first gear, same thing with a thermal imager. The imager is going to be operating in temperatures of 0 to 300 degrees. As we start to get more speed, or in the thermal imager's case, more heat, the imager is going to shift into what we call low gain mode. When we go into low gain mode, we're actually in second gear, and the imager is going to be working in temperatures up to 1120 degrees. When we get into this mode, at 500 degree surface temperature, you're going to see yellow start to show up in the imager. At 800 degree surface temperature, you're going to start to see orange show up into the imager. At 1,000 degree surface temperature, you're going to see red start to show up in the imager. Again, the imager is going to start off in first gear, high gain mode. It's going to operate in temperatures up to 300 degrees. When it sees something in excess of 300 degrees, it's going to momentarily shift. You're going to see the imager pause, perfectly normal. That pause is going to be for about 1/3 of a second. It's going to shift into the low gain mode. It's going to operate in temperatures up to 1120 degrees. As the temperatures get higher, we should see yellow, orange, and red. And what I'd like to do now is just play a quick video clip. And what you're going to see is the imager go from high gain into low gain, but the surface temperature of the object isn't going to be high enough that you're going to see color at this point in time. You're just going to see the imager shift. All right, now that we've gone through the modes of the thermal imager, and you've seen how the imager momentarily freezes up, shifting from first gear to second gear, you're going to see another freeze up with the thermal imager, and it's perfectly normal, but there's no telling when it's going to happen. Basically what's happening is the heat is coming into the thermal imager, it's going to that focal plane array, the pixel area, and the pixels are always constantly filling up with heat. And eventually they'd just fill up to the point where it would reach the top, overflow, and do what we call saturate into the other pixels. And if that happens, the image goes blank and we don't see anything. So the imager, as the heat is coming up the pixel and filling that pixel up, what it's going to do is it's going to get to a point in that pixel where it's going to take and it's going to freeze frame. When it does, it's going to be that same 1/3 of a second, and the imager is going to freeze up on you. And when it does, it's going to electronically release all the heat from this pixel and bring it back down to the 0 point. As you're using the imager, it's going to fill up again. When it gets to a certain point, it's going to freeze frame, and it's going to dump all the heat that's in that pixel again. And it's going to continually do this while you are inside fighting the fire. One thing that you're going to notice, the more temperature difference and variance that you're in, the more you're going to see that shutter happening with the thermal imager. Perfectly normal, nothing to worry about. Just be advised, if you're doing a search or a sweep and you're scanning real fast, a third of a second, you can lose a lot of distance that you're actually searching there. So you want to make sure that you're going at a slow, constant speed, and when it does, we just kind of stop for a second, hold on, and then continue on with your search at that point in time. All right, guys, we're to the infamous black button on the top of the thermal imager, the electronic thermal throttle. Probably one of the best options that we came out with on the thermal imager, in my opinion, but it's probably one of the ones that we as firefighters totally misunderstand the use or the application of using the electronic thermal throttle. A lot of people think of this as a contrast button. Please don't think of it that way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the electronic thermal throttle to try to pinpoint heat signatures. The only way that I can use the electronic thermal throttle is I manually have to put it into the operational mode. So with a T3, it's up here on top of the thermal imager. With the Eclipse, it's the black button down here at the bottom of the imager, or the front of the imager. When I turn the imager on, or turn the thermal throttle on, basically what I'm doing is I'm hitting the front button right here. And when I did, what I've done is I've put it into a manual mode, and it's operating at 0 to 500 degrees temperature. When I did that, the hottest object in the field of view at that point in time is going to show up as blue. And I'm picking something between 0 and 500 degrees. So just arbitrarily, I'm going to say that whatever I'm looking at in the imager right now is showing up blue, and the temperature of that blue is 100. I still have a lot of white going on in the imager. So I can add and detract heat. So the front button turns the imager on, and if I want to increase the amount of heat, the more blue in the image, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the front button again. If I want to take blue out of the image and reduce the amount of heat that's being shown, I'm going to hit the rear button. So front button, I'm putting more blue into the image. When I put more blue, it's going from, say, 100 degrees to 105 degrees, to 110 degrees, to 115 degrees each time I click it. If I hit the rear button, if I started at 100, you would be seeing blue at 100, but then each time I click it, we're probably going down about another 5 degrees. Understand that's not the surface temperature of an object, that is the ambient temperature of everything that the imager is seeing at this point in time. If I want to shut the imager off, I shouldn't say that, if I want to shut the thermal throttle off, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to push down on both buttons simultaneously. With the Eclipse, to turn the thermal imager on, I'm going to hit the left-hand side of the button here. Once it's on and it's activated, the left-hand button is going to bring the temperature up, more blue. The right-hand button is going to take and bring the temperature down, less blue. And to turn this imager, again, I correct myself, to turn this thermal throttle off, I'm going to push both buttons down simultaneously. When I get into just some of the applications as far as using the thermal throttle, overhaul is definitely one. What I'm looking at is a lot of times when I come into the building, I knock down the fire, I see a whole lot of white going on. But is it white because things are still burning, or is it white because it's just radiated heat from the fire? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pinpoint what I have to actually open up and check for extension, and what just becomes radiated heat. Of course, with the industrial uses, we're going to use it as a comparison for overheated equipment. You come into the room, you get a mechanical room, and you can smell all this smoke going on. But I got 40, 50 different motors in front of me. You know, which one is the one that's overheated? We're just going to use that thermal throttle as a comparison. Same thing with smells and bells. A big thing for us is overheated ballast. When you come into the room, you got all that, you can smell that, that smoke from the ballast. But which one is overheated? I have 50, 60 lights up over my head. If I take the imager and I just tag one of those ballasts right there, it gives me a reference point to build from. Now understand, when I do this, I can actually hit the overheated ballast and not see something that, you know, I'm never going to see, you know, heat increase as I look at these things. If you're still smelling ballast and you haven't been able to find anything hotter, we probably hit the hottest ballast initially. So in that situation, all we do is back up, take the imager out of the thermal throttle mode, find a different ballast, and then what we're going to do is tag that new ballast and then just use it as a comparison to the one that we looked at the first time around. This time, when I look at it, that ballast shows up blue, and I know I have an overheated ballast. So the really nice thing is, when I come into a room and I have all this white that's going on, all I do is take the imager, I put that thermal throttle in, and I find the immediate area that I have to check for extension. All this stuff here, even though it's showing up as hot, is just radiated heat from the fire. I really don't have to worry about it at that point in time. What I want to do is, when I look at this right here, I just want to bring you into a video that's going to just kind of reinforce some of the things that we're looking at with the thermal throttle as far as overhaul, light ballast, and investigations. The next thing I want to do under operation of the thermal imager and understanding the image is talk to you about color. And when we talk about color, before we even get to color, you have to understand when we turn the thermal imager on, it's going to come up in high gain, 0 to 300 degrees. When it does that, there'll be no color, everything is just a grayscale. The only thing that's going to be working for you as far as added features to the imager is the relative heat indicator. So in that 0 to 300 degree range, on the right hand side of the imager is going to be your heat indicator, and that's going to be working in that, high gain mode. When it sees something in excess of 300 degrees, it's going to freeze, it's going to go into the next mode, low gain, and the imager is going to be working in that 0 to 1120 degree range. When it sees surface temperature in excess of 500 degrees, the super red hot indicator is kicking in at that point in time. At 500 degrees surface temperature, you're going to be seeing yellow. From 800 to 1,000, the heat indicator is going to be showing you orange as your surface temperature. And once it gets to 1,000 degrees, the relative heat indicator is going to be showing you red. So when I look at the image, you're going to be seeing shades of black and white. You're going to be seeing, you could be seeing shades of yellow, orange, and red, depending upon the objects and what the surface temperature of each object is. What I want to do is just run into a short video. You're going to see a room that's got a lot of fire. Firefighters come into the room. There's going to be a tremendous amount of red, surface temperature all in excess of 1,000 degrees. You're going to see the firefighters open a hand line and then start to cool it down. And you're going to gradually see the image go from red to orange to yellow back into the grayscale of black and white. All right, now that we've covered color, and hopefully you guys have a little bit better understanding of that, what I want to do is spend a couple of minutes here just talking to you about temperature measurement. All the thermal imagers are going to have temperature measurement on there. But when we talk about temperature measurement, there's some things that you have to understand about this. The very first thing is all the thermal imagers have what they call a distance to spot ratio. And depending upon what the imager is, the distance to spot ratio is going to be a little bit different. So basically all we're doing here is showing you a diagram of a flashlight. If I were to take and turn on the flashlight and I got a 3-to-1 ratio, what that means is at 3 feet I'm seeing this area right here. But the imager is preset to 3-to-1, but if I come back and I'm 6 or 8 feet away, now what I'm seeing is the temperature of the entire board area right there. So unless you know exactly what the distance to spot ratio is, the temperature of the material, we're not really sure is going to be accurate.
Gary, what is the spot to distance ratio on a T3 Max?
On a T3 Max, the distance to spot ratio would be 30-to-1.
Okay.
Okay? When we talk about the materials, all materials are going to have what we call an emissivity value. Big word, don't even worry about remembering what emissivity value is. It's not important to us as firefighters. But what's important to us is understanding that all materials are going to absorb and dissipate heat at a different rate. So if I were to give you a brick and a 2x4 and I set it down in front of your firehouse, let it sit there all day in the sun at 90 degrees, I come back at 9 o'clock at night, the brick is still going to have a lot of heat left inside it. The piece of wood is going to have a lot less heat. So the brick is absorbing heat quicker, it's holding the heat longer than the 2x4. The third thing that we need to understand, and this is a big one that's going to play out for us as firefighters, is understanding the reflectivity of the object itself. So I come into the room and with my eyes, I look at the pot on the stove right here, and I know that the stove is on and I know that it's hot. When I go into IR, I take the imager, and what I'm doing is I've lined the crosshairs up just off the burner at the bottom of the pot. So we know that this burner right here is probably at least 400 or 500 degrees, somewhere in that temperature range. But if I were just simply to bring up the crosshairs of the imager and look at the bottom of the pot, you can see that my temperature gauge is only saying that it's 100 degrees right here. Understand that if I were to pick up that pot with my bare hands and touch it, it's not 100 degrees. Something that's 100 degrees I can pick up and I'm not going to burn myself. But looking at this right here, you guys know that if you pick that up with your bare hands, you're going to burn yourself. So understand that the temperature is going to be different. And the other thing with the reflectivity, I can actually be seeing the temperature of something behind you with the thermal imager. You're standing here, you're looking at the pot in front of you, But because this is a reflective image, you're actually picking up the temperature of something behind you at that point in time. A lot to understand about temperature gauges and how they actually work. Any other questions? Okay, winding down as far as thermal imaging goes, what I just want to do is cover some of the more common applications. There's 4 applications that we always think about using thermal imaging for, and the first one is search and rescue. With search and rescue, just remember that when I'm using the imager and I'm looking for the victim is not always going to show up as white. It depends upon what the background is. So in this situation, I come into the room, the victim is white, but understand, if the room is really hot, we want that victim to be dark. If the room is pretty much the same temperature as the victim, you may not even see the victim there. So remember, victim can be white, victim can be black, victim may be almost unidentifiable with a thermal imager. Second one is fire attack. When we're using the thermal imager, what we're trying to do is find the seat of the fire with the imager. We want to take a look at the thermal layering that's going on in the building. When I come into the building, just take the thermal imager and find where that thermal layer is, and use that as a benchmark. All right? I've identified my thermal layer as here. I go off, I do all the other things that I need to do as a firefighter, and 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes from now, I take the imager and I look across the room, and I see my thermal layer has come down. What that's telling me is that I'm not delivering enough fire, the fire is still gaining on me at this point in time. So you may want to think about getting additional lines into the building, or trying something different there. I come in and my thermal layer is here, and 7, 8 minutes later, I take and my thermal layer has gone up to here. Now I know that I'm making some good progress on this fire. The water application is taking care of the heat that's being generated here. When you use the thermal imager and you find that thermal layer, make sure you keep your people down below the thermal layer. If you're down below it, you're actually going to be seeing the heat building, and you're going to see, if conditions are deteriorating or getting better. But if you're up here in the thermal layer, my thermal layer is here, and I'm standing here with a thermal imager, I'm actually up in the thermal layer. You're still going to be able to see building construction and things that are going on, but you're not actually going to be seeing what the heat is doing inside that building. So make sure you stay down below the thermal layer. The next thing we want to do is talk about investigations. Mrs. Smith calls us, smell of smoke in the house. Right now we're just walking around and trying to find where the smoke is from the worst and feeling things. If I come in, Mrs. Smith says, yeah, the smoke is, it smells the worst in this room right here. Take the imager, do a quick scan, you see the heat signature, and you know something is going on. Smells and bells type calls, I have an overheated ballast. It's pretty difficult to come into a room with 40, 50 ballast. Just take the imager, look up at the ceiling, and you're going to be able to identify which one is hot. Overhaul, of course, this is a big one for us in the fire service. What we want to do is try to diminish the time that we're on the fire ground. And this is when, the fun is over. All right? If I take the imager, I can look around, and with the thermal throttle, I've already identified what I have to open up. This is the stuff that I have to open up. Even though I have other white going on, that's pretty much radiated heat at that point in time. So if you understand the thermal throttle and how to read that, you can drastically reduce the amount of overhaul that you're doing on the fire ground. As far as additional applications go, real quickly, I just threw some things up here. We all talk about accountability systems, but if you think about it, I'm in a room full of smoke. It's really kind of hard to sit there and read names off a passport system. But if I have a thermal imager, I can very easily count the people that I have in there. Thermal imager is a great tool as far as looking at building construction. I can see trusses above my head, stuff that I couldn't see, with the imager or without an imager before. Motor vehicle accidents, I'm not looking for the motor vehicle accident. What I'm doing is, I'm trying to assess how many people were inside the car. So I can take the imager, I can look at seats, I can see heat signatures, and I can tell if people have been ejected out of the car. And I can also use the imager to look for the people once they've been ejected out of the car. Of course, exposures, great tool. I just take the imager, I'm looking at the other building, and I'm just seeing how much heat that building is starting to acquire. Extension could be in the building that's burning where you're at, or it could be extension into to other buildings, the exposure buildings. Electrical emergencies, great tool as far as taking the imager or arriving on scene. Take the imager, look up over your head, find the wire, or in this case there is no wire. But before you take the image, or before you jump off the truck and possibly step on a live line, we can use the imager, look out there in front of us, we can see where the imager is coming down, we can see the energized line on the ground. If it's across the fences, the imager will actually show the fences in the energized, as an energized fence at that point in time. Of course, training, every single one of us, been through a recruit school and, screwed up on the inside of the building doing a search, and, we always blame the instructor. But, if the instructor is videotaping you and showing you, what you're doing with the, when you go in and do your search, the imager is a great training tool. It's going to tell us what we as firefighters are doing wrong. Ventilation, I can go up on a roof. I can use it to, I can tell the hot spots. Having been to a few fires in my career, I can't tell you how many times I've cut a hole in the wrong spot because I thought I was venting directly above the seat of the fire, but I was off by 20, 30 feet. But the imager, if you got heat up in that area, you're actually going to see that heat signature and know where to vent. Firefighter safety as a whole, great tool. I mean, as a company officer, from the time I'm getting off the rig till the time I'm coming back outside, I have zero visibility inside the building most of the time. But with a thermal imager, now I know if I have my crew and the crew's intact. Hazmat, we've shown you some video where you actually see some applications as far as looking at tanks and liquid level. Of course, RIT teams, you always want a thermal imager, especially with a RIT team. Just to help you get into the building and find the person a lot quicker. From the incident commander's point of view, size up, great tool. I arrive on scene. As I'm doing my 360 around the building, there may not be smoke coming out, but you may have a great heat buildup in one portion of the building. And when you see that heat buildup, it's a good indicator, okay, I got to come in, first floor, up the set of stairs, I'm taking a left, and my fire room is up there to the left-hand side of the building. So really the sky is the limit as far as thermal imaging goes. Basically anything that we do as a firefighter, there's an application as far as using the imager. The one thing that I would say is that firefighter safety is the paramount reason for using thermal imagers. But understand, the imager isn't going to do it all for us. You have to look at the imager, you have to interpret what the imager is telling you, and understand, the imager doesn't know that this is a chair, a table, a podium, the floor. The imager only knows it's the temperature of something, and it's up to you to figure out what that something is. So I hope you guys learned a little bit, and if you have any questions, feel free to give me a holler. All right, we're down to like the last chapter in thermal imaging. So what we want to do is just kind of go over some care and maintenance as far as the thermal imaging goes. So first thing I want to talk about the imager itself. When you come back from the fire, don't be afraid to get the thing wet, okay? Mild soap and water on the imager and the casing. If you got a stubborn stain, you can scrub it with a soft bristle brush, and it's not going to hurt the case of the imager. If you got really stubborn stains, you can put some isopropyl alcohol on there and try to bring the imager back. Do not put any isopropyl alcohol on the display, and do not put it on the lens of the imager. Both of them will make it cloudy and make it difficult to see through. The display cover and straps are about the only things that are field repairable. So if you get to the point where the Velcro isn't holding on the strap, all it is a simple screw in the front here. Just undo the screw, run the webbing back through, or the strap back through, hook the Velcro over itself, it's been replaced. The display, 4 screws on the display here, just undo them. Get your new display, put it on there. Make sure you do not take and touch the display with your fingers. Even though it doesn't look like there's any smudge mark when you look at it with your eyes, I guarantee you that when you turn on the imager, that thumbprint or that fingerprint is going to be showing up at that point in time. And that's really about it as far as care and maintenance goes. Again, real quickly, mild soap and water. Take the anything that other than the strap or the display that needs to be repaired has to go back to both.